Welcome to History 101. Today we'll be looking at the rise of the Catholic Church. Remember that this is an introductory course, so we'll be covering a lot of material in very kind of general ways, just because there's so much to cover. Okay, so we're going to start with the rise of the Church. I'll try not to be dogmatic, but definitely we're going to be talking about certain things that relate to Catholicism and Christianity. First, I want to show you a picture. This is a medieval picture from, I think, around the 800s. And what I want you to notice in this picture is that you have a few key figures. You have the church on this side and this person over here, but then you also have the king. And the Middle Ages is really defined by this relationship between the church and the state. So we have the Pope right here anointing the king. And the question that kind of arises from these type of pictures is as to who has authority. And this would be a question that we'll address as we move forward. So I just want to kind of set the tone, because sometimes we believe the king is all powerful, sometimes we believe the church is all powerful. And in this picture, we see more of a semiotic relationship where they're both really dependent on each other. One is not more powerful than the other. Depending on the circumstance, one might have more authority, but it just depends. And it's just a very intriguing question that shapes the Middle Ages. So the goals for today's lecture will be, number one, to show you how the Middle Ages is kind of a fusion of kind of barbarian culture, which again we see in that picture with the king. We see Christianity again in that picture, and we see Roman culture, all fused into something new, which hence defines the Middle Ages. This is nothing new to us as Americans. I mean, we are a melting pot of multiple cultures. With all these groups coming in, we create something new. With Rome collapsing, you have a new world emerge during this period. And then second, kind of like the overarching theme here is looking at the role of the Catholic Church. So we can't separate the church from the Middle Ages because they're just so intertwined and they shape many aspects of this world, everything from the social to the economical. So we have to talk about the rise of the Catholic Church and its influence. So here's a map. I'm going to take you a little bit further back before the Middle Ages, kind of set the context, and look at the Roman Empire, particularly in its later period, not at the heights of its power, but rather as the Roman Empire begins to collapse. And here you see how it's kind of divided into two kind of major sections. It's a big territory, and for one person to control all this territory, it's almost impossible. So Diocletian actually separates the empire into two. It divides it into two, where you have two Roman emperors, and the theory was that this was supposed to maintain it. In reality, it kind of helped create more conflicts as we move forward. So this is about the year 300. And then you have all these other people vying for power after that. And then really by the 500, we see the Roman Empire move from basically what was the center here in Rome, and it moves over here to Constantinople. So as I mentioned earlier, Diocletian is the emperor who kind of brings order. Throughout the 200s, Roman emperors came and went. A lot of times they were killed, or bad things happened to them. And Diocletian was able to kind of create some reform to stabilize its collapse. So he divides it into two, as we mentioned earlier. He reforms the army, and this brings stability to this massive entity. But the most important person that comes after Diocletian is, you see him in the picture over here, is Constantine. Constantine is an important figure. He is a Roman emperor. He eventually does take over the Roman Empire. And he does a few kind of key things that, again, this is an intro class. We're just going to touch on a few things. But he does a few things that shapes the, what we call late antiquity. Number one, Christianity was, a very kind of small religion during this period. And I think only about maybe even less than 10% of people worshipped this faith. But it becomes a very important religion as we move into the 300s. So there was this kind of resentment towards Christians during this period, not as much as maybe popular culture tends to represent it. But what Constantine does is that he passes the Edict of Milan, and he allows people to worship the faith that they want, to some extent. So what we would call today religious freedom, right? Now, part of this has to do with some event that he went through. He was at a war. He was outnumbered. He thought he was going to lose, and he looked up at the sky, and there was a sign up there that told him, that kind of foretold him that he was going to win this battle, and he did. In return, he said, if this does happen, I'll practice his faith. He actually doesn't convert until his deathbed. But with the passage of this edict, Christianity went from a religion on the run to all of a sudden one of the most important religions in the empire. So now note that there are other religions there too. The Romans still have their gods, but it is noted that I think by the 380s, Christianity becomes about 70% of the population in the Roman Empire. So it grows fairly quickly. And a lot of it had to do is because Christianity provided something for the underclass to some extent. It provided an afterlife, if that other religions didn't. So you go from a religion on the run, right? Nobody wanted to be Christians. In the early 300s and before, to know Christian texts, you were considered a bit of an idiot, right? They wanted you to know the greats, the Cicero, the Ovids. By all of a sudden in the 380s, if you know Christianity, you're the smartest person in the room. So it's kind of interesting how things begin to change. But now that you have become the major religion, you have all these important posts throughout the Roman Empire. You have bishops in important cities like Constantinople, like Alexandria, like Rome, right? So every major city has a bishop that's a Christian bishop. And you can only imagine during this period, there are a lot of different beliefs as to what is Christianity. And there's a major debate, because again, as I noted earlier, at one time, Christianity was just trying to survive. By the 380s, all of a sudden you are the number one faith. And you have to start defining, well, what is our faith with so many different beliefs? It is around this period in the 300s where the Bible is actually finally kind of collected as a text, as an official text of this faith, which means a lot of books were kind of left out, and which also means that a lot of people were picking and choosing what defines this faith. Another major debate that you have is this concept called Arianism. So if you're Christian today, you probably agree with the idea that, the Holy Trinity are three entities, but at the same time that they are one, together, right? The God, the Holy Ghost, and Jesus. Now, my point here really is that during this period, this is an issue of debate because there was a group of Christians who questioned that idea, saying, how can God and Jesus be the same thing? When one is supposed to be superior and the other one is supposed to be inferior. It just doesn't make logical sense. And this group was known as the Arianists, right? Not white power Arianists, but this new kind of branch of Christianity that could not reconcile this argument of how three things can be one. So in 325, Constantine held a meeting at the Council of Nicaea where they basically addressed many aspects of Christianity. Again, prior to this period, Christianity was a hodgepodge of beliefs. By 325, you begin to see, I guess, this idea of order. So I know we would like to think that, the Bible, from wherever, and was handed to Christians and said, here's your book, go ahead and follow it. And nothing could be further from the truth. There was many debates, there was many councils. But this is a great example where we see the Roman emperor bring together all these people and hash it out, basically. They're going to figure out what is Christianity. And one of the biggest issues was this concept of Arianism. So a lot of important things come out of the Council of Nicaea. I think the Creed comes out of this council too. I just want to quickly show you a picture of early Jesus. Many of us have this kind of perception of Jesus having long hair and muscular body and kind of sacrificing figure. Early Jesus is quite different, he's also white in kind of the European mindset. Here he's a little bit darker. He actually has short hair. A lot of times he's represented as kind of like a little pudgy kid with kind of brownish, goldish hair maybe. So we see even the representation of Jesus kind of change. I think he has short hair too. So that has its own interesting history. So as Christianity is gaining ground, you have something else that's happening at the same time. And that is that Rome is falling. So when Constantine moves the Roman Empire to Constantinople, there's a power vacuum to some extent left in Rome. Rome used to have a population of about 1 million people. By this period, I think it's down to a couple 100,000. So it just goes to show how this city that was probably a wonder of the world begins to kind of disappear. So you have all these, what the Romans labeled barbarians, move west into their territories and begin to attack them. Now, they weren't there really to destroy. If you look at the history of this particular period, particularly with the barbarians, many of these groups, many of them fought for the Romans, right? Many of them were paid by the Romans. And so many of them acquired the taste of Roman culture. So even though it's viewed in a very kind of generic way that this was an attack on Rome and these people were like a new group taking over, it's not really the case. Yes, they had their own kind of political systems, but they had a taste for Roman culture. So many of them wanted to be Roman. Many of them wanted some of the goods that Romans had. So by 410, most historians have noted that this is when Rome really begins to kind of collapse. The Visigoths, who eventually end up in Spain, attack Rome, actually take it over. They depose the last Roman emperor. His name is Romulus Augustulus, which is ironic because it has the name of the founder of Rome and the name of the first emperor, right? But by 476, the Roman Empire essentially collapses. And instead, now that you have this new group kind of come in, they begin to shape Roman culture. Now, this is significant because it shapes the medieval world as we move forward. The Romans had an orderly community. They were very structured. They had very kind of structured laws. The word civilization a lot of times is associated with Roman culture, right, along with Greeks. When these, what the Romans call barbarians begin to come in, they don't have the political infrastructure to take over such a massive city. So things really begin to kind of fall apart, if you will. Not completely, because Rome continues on, but things begin to slowly erode from what people remember it. Also, there's an economic shift. So the economic center at this period was in Constantinople, not in Rome. And this group too, I mean, they are paid by the Romans, right, to fight, to kind of protect their northeastern borders. So many of them are just warrior class. Unlike the Romans, who are somewhat educated, this group are, they're just a bunch of knuckleheads, right? Who were paid to fight, and that's all they really know how to do, to plunder. So they do some of this. A lot of times they don't know how to read. They're obviously not educated in the Roman way. So they have to have people help them when it comes to governing. So understand that Christianity is something that's being built, right? As I said in the previous lecture, there are many kind of forms of Christianity early on. Every region has its own kind of twist on it. But by the 300-400s, you really begin to see Christianity solidify into a homogeneous faith, if you will. It has to do with a few people that shape it. There is this idea called Neoplatonism. Now, if you ever taken philosophy, you probably have heard of Plato. This idea that things in the material world are not real. Only ideas that exist in the abstract are real. Things in the material world are kind of cheap imitations of those perfect concepts. So let's take, for example, a book. Well, we all know what a book looks like, right? And we probably have many books around us. But the perfect example of a book exists out in some kind of abstract world, right? It's more of an idea. And the books that we own are just kind of cheap replicas of that. Now that's something that you see in the city of God, not the book part, but this idea that there's something perfect in the abstract, but everything on earth is a cheap imitation of that, or obviously not as perfect. Now, Plotinus kind of utilizes Plato's idea to make this connection with Christianity. And he argues that everything has a connection to a supreme deity, right? He argues that the body has a soul, right? Everybody has a soul, and we all have flesh. Now, these are two separate things. And ultimately, the soul needs to separate from the body. The body corrupts us. The body is dirty. The body has certain desires that might go against a pure, clean soul. So ultimately, the goal is to have the soul leave the body. This is an important element of Christianity because we still follow this idea to some extent, right? We believe, we want to keep our soul clean, but our body has certain goals, whether it be food, right, or whether it be water, or even sexuality. So Plotinus kind of argues this kind of point that in order to be in spiritual union with God, we must let go of these kind of earthly bondages that we have, which essentially is the body, right? The body maintains us here, while the soul wants to be connected to God. So not that the goal is to die, but eventually if you do die and you live kind of like a good moral life, you're going to be connected with God. Now we see this in many ways. One example is Augustine, the city of God that you just read, right? You have this perfect city which exists in the heavens, right? And then you have an imperfect city that's going through chaos, which is Rome, which is what Augustine's kind of describing here. And the goal really is to create heaven on earth. So he doesn't say, oh, just go ahead and die because you can go to a great city right away. He says, look, you need to live a good life here, and eventually that's going to pay off once you leave this earth and go into heaven. So this idea might sound more complex than it actually is, because in reality we still use it and we still have it. It might not be religious, but it's still there, right? So this just kind of reiterates what I just said, that we can't just kill ourselves or just try to reach heaven as quickly as possible. We're here to serve God. We try to create His kingdom here on earth, and eventually that will pay off. So when we go to heaven, we'll be in the earthly city. So St. Augustine, who is a church father, becomes very important in shaping early Christianity. He writes other other things, and you can read that on your own. I believe you can get City of God for free, and some of his other works too. But people like him begin to shape Christianity. Another important figure is Jerome. Jerome is able to take these texts that are written in many languages and translate it into Latin. Basically, he takes the Bible, and if you ever read the Bible, you know that it's like we said earlier, it's a hodgepodge of different sources written in many different languages, and he's able to synthesize it and translate it into one common language. And this is important as we move forward because Latin becomes the language of the church. Now, they are borrowing from the Romans, but it does become this common language that people use within this particular institution. So again, he's another important church father. Now, when it comes to church, the church wasn't created with a pope at the center of this faith. During this period, the 400s, you have a lot of important figures, a lot of important cities with bishops in each one of them. And any of them could have claimed this kind of authority over Christianity. So how did Rome become the ultimate authority, particularly for the Catholic Church? Well, in Constantinople, you have a bishop of Constantinople, and you also have the emperor there. And typically, the emperor supersedes any other authority, right? Because he is the emperor. And bishops just do whatever the emperors tell them to do. Alexandria is another important city. I know there's one more, I can't remember. But, there's a few of them. And they all have bishops. Now, with the Roman Empire moving to the east part of it, you have the city of Rome basically empty, right? With really no key authority. Now, there are times where the Roman emperor still kind of controls it, but for the most part, they're left on their own. And somebody needs to take in that kind of power vacuum, and it's the popes who argue that they're the ones who lead the city, even though they're supposed to be spiritual. Back then, there's really no difference between a spiritual entity and a governing entity. So it's Pope Leo I who implements this idea that the church, the Bishop of Rome is the ultimate authority of this new Christian faith. And he does this by using what's called the Petrine supremacy. He argued, if you know this from history, St. Peter and Paul both actually end up dying in Rome, right? So, since Peter was the first bishop of Rome, and since Jesus designated him as his representative here on earth, whoever takes his position, therefore, will be the leader of this new Christian faith. So whoever takes the position of Bishop of Rome essentially controls this new faith. Now, this is the way to kind of justify it. However, understand that there's nobody in Rome to kind of rule anything, right? Rome is basically on its own. So this is part of a power vacuum that they use this Petrine supremacy to justify being the leaders of this city and also of this faith. Again, this is very kind of general, but this essentially is how things kind of happen, how the Catholic Church begins to kind of dominate this faith. Now, another issue that we see within the Catholic Church is the role of women. Early on, during the origins of Christianity, we see women take a very prominent role within, the church. Many of them were leaders within. Many of them were martyrs. Many of them died for this faith, right? Many of them taught this faith. So, some of them were priests. So what happened? Why did they all of a sudden take a very secondary role within this faith? Well, a lot of it has to do with the way patriarchy was replicated within the Catholic Church. So what we see happening is that the Catholic Church takes or borrows a lot from the Roman Empire. Even things like basilicas, they borrow that kind of church structure from the Romans. So the Catholic Church does a lot of plagiarizing, if you will, and one of them is the way they viewed women. And since there is a lot of patriarchy within the Catholic Church, within Roman culture, and these people are still essentially Roman, they kind of borrow some of those ideas as to why women are viewed as second-class citizens. One of these things that they begin to practice is this concept called asceticism, and you might know this if you're Catholic, that there's certain times of the year where you're supposed to renounce certain things. A lot of times it's like meat on Fridays and things like that, right? But we see this in other ways in the Catholic Church, particularly among the monks, where they begin to renunciate certain things, particularly the will of an individual, right? So one of them is food, but another part is also sex. And during this period, it is a very kind of patriarchal culture where women are actually blamed for tempting men, right? So they want to keep their souls clean, but they feel that there's certain there are certain temptress in society, whether it be women or food or whatever it may be, that corrupt them. So one of them is women. So they're kind of blaming women for tempting them to engage in sex. So women kind of get the blame, and this is part of, again, that Roman culture that women should not be leaders, and it's justified in many ways. Part of it has to do with the whole Adam and Eve story. Women are seen as corrupting men, right? Eve gave the apple to Adam, therefore corrupting him. So women kind of begin to be chastised early on in this new Christian faith, whereas before it becomes this dominant entity, women have very prominent roles, right? They were priests and led church readings and things like that. So now when women were seen as something negative, something that corrupted society. So we're continuing to look at how the Catholic Church becomes this imposing power over Europe in this late antiquity period. So let's continue that conversation by looking at some of the other ways that the Catholic Church instituted its authority over this region. So, as I stated earlier in one of the previous lectures, is that when you have this new warrior class, these barbarians, right, these Visigoths and so forth, take over places of, that were once part of the Roman Empire, well, yes, they can go in there and plunder, but once they begin to settle, somebody needs to rule. And there's already a power structure there in place, which they're obviously not familiar with. So you need somebody to help in that process. And we see the Catholic Church take an important step here, at least Christians take important steps. So because some of these warrior barbarians don't know how to read, it's the church that steps in. And they help in advising and governing these different regions throughout Europe. So we have people like the Ambrose of Milan, who becomes like an advisor. And one important statement that he makes is that, he states this point that the emperor is within the church, not above the church, kind of arguing that he sees the church, if not equal, superior then to the state. So going back to that picture that I showed you at the beginning of the lectures, right? Who has more authority? Is it the guy being baptized, which is the king, or is it the person baptizing him? Well, here we see the Catholic Church essentially arguing we are more important. At least the Christian Church. And it's really Pope Gregory the Great in about the 6th century where he essentially establishes what we would call a papal state, which is basically a country, right? A kingdom. And the papal state is actually still there. If you ever go to Rome, there's a place called Vatican City, and they're independent from the rest of Italy. The Vatican City is its own basically country, and if you can enter the Vatican without using a passport, but if you want to enter Vatican City, like other parts of it, you actually need your passport to get into it. So Pope Gregory the Great sees himself as a continuation of Roman emperors, not, um, you know, um, bowing down to the emperor in Constantinople, but almost as his equal. Now, this become an issue because a pope is only as strong as his warriors, and they have none, right? They're a spiritual institution. So when you read the first chapter on Charlemagne, Charlemagne becomes this kind of important figure that protects the church, and the church feels like it no longer needs to follow whatever the Eastern Roman Emperor dictates. So, but this is 300 years before all that. In this example, we do see the Catholic Church saying we are basically our own country over here in Rome, in Italy, because there is nobody to guide them. Everybody basically left for the eastern part of the empire. Now, I think I mentioned earlier that yes, about 80% of the population, particularly in the Mediterranean, might be converted to Christianity. You still have a lot of people who believe in different things, particularly as you move into northern Europe. People like the Franks and the Saxons and so forth in England and Ireland. Well, it's people who go out there to convert them that become very important. However, before we get into that, we begin to see this concept of monasticism develop within the Christian faith. This is where the monks come out, who eventually go out and preach the Bible and try to convert people. But before all that, there are people who are trying to adhere to those values of asceticism. As I mentioned earlier, Rome is collapsing, right? Society feels like it's in a free fall. And, people want to connect with God. And there's a few kind of important figures, people like St. Anthony. I think he's the one that kind of starts off this monastic movement. And what he does is actually leaves kind of like the material world and goes into Egypt and just goes into the desert and tries to survive on whatever's out there. And he focuses on his spirituality because that's his ultimate goal. I think he lives like 100 years. He lives a long life at the very least. And, living off whatever's there, and focuses on his spirituality. So you have a few people who kind of mimic that idea of leaving this material world and, renouncing material wealth and trying to have a spiritual connection with God. And they can only do this alone. So you have a lot of people who either go to the desert or go into the mountains or just try to leave wherever society's at and focus on their spirituality. So these were called the purists. The purists are the ones who focus, who leave, again, I guess society or, civilized society for lack of a better word. And, some of them end up in Greece. They find these kind of rock pillars and they establish a home on top of them, and people sometimes come bring them food. And they're a bit of a wonder for this period because most of us couldn't do that, right? Imagine, you probably have your cars, your home, your iPhones and all that stuff. And imagine just saying, I'm going to leave all this stuff behind. I'm going to go into the, White Rock Mountains and contemplate God. And, I'm not going to ask for anything. No material wealth. I'll just wear whatever cloth is on my back and focus on my spirituality. Well, most of us couldn't do that, right? So it's a very kind of hard decision to make to lead this life. But you have a few people who do it, and they actually get a following. It's like, make a false comparison, kind of like people following people on YouTube today, right? People begin to look up to them and go and seek them out, and they feel like these people who are living this monastic life have a special connection to God. So they feel like if they can go talk to them, they can talk to God in their favor and give them whatever they may need. So we have many examples of people going and seeking out some of these reclusive people and asking for multiple things like, can you please help, say a prayer so my son gets better, or I broke my favorite dish, can you please fuse it together? It is that ridiculous at times. And they they become the rock stars of this early medieval period, people kind of looking at them. And because of this, they gain a lot of popularity. People begin to leave them money, wealth, material things. And this is where you have the materialist movement of the monastic order. It's Saint Benedict of Nursia who establishes an order of how monastic life should be like. He creates monasteries basically in the middle of nowhere. And it's a very kind of structured life of what you do. Basically, you don't live alone because you're living with a group of people, but you don't talk. You obviously you don't take on the pleasures of life. And it's a very difficult life, and a lot of people can't do it. It's indicated that people actually try to kill Saint Benedict because they couldn't stand him. He was too structured. They felt like he was too harsh, and they just couldn't take it anymore. And both times that when they tried to kill him, they failed. I think one time they tried to poison his water, and they got knocked down. And another time they tried to give him some poisoned bread, and some bird came up and took it away. So Saint Benedict establishes basically the rules of what it means to be in a monastic order at this time. Now, another group of monks that are important to this story, again, they're the ones who are spreading Christianity, are these kind of monks that traveled throughout Europe. So I just give you one example, Augustine the monk. Don't confuse them with St. Augustine. They're living in different eras. And what he does, he goes throughout Europe and tries to convert different tribes, some of these pagans, some of these barbarians. And it's really difficult because, they have their own belief systems too. So how do you convert somebody who doesn't want to be converted? Well, one thing that we find, and you all probably know this already, but one thing that we find when it comes to conversion is that they take a lot of rituals that are already in paganism and match them up to Christian rituals. So one of the best examples is the winter solstice. Both the Romans and some of these pagan tribes celebrated the winter solstice, and Christianity kind of fused that into the Christian faith, and lo and behold, right, we got Jesus' birthday on December 25th, even though the winter solstice is on the 21st. But, it's close enough where they're able to take different rituals that are important to their faith and mix them in, into the Christian faith, and you create this kind of new fusion of Christianity. So Augustine, again, traveled throughout the German area, Bavaria, Saxony, and so forth, try to convert some of these people, and sometimes he was successful, but as you can kind of see in this picture, these people sometimes didn't want to be converted, and they kill him. He ends up getting killed, as you can kind of see in this picture. But then they become martyrs, and they become even bigger rock stars. I believe the Saxons aren't converted until Charlemagne basically gives them a choice: you convert or you die. So it takes a while, but this is part of that process of how Christianity begins to spread throughout Europe. It's important to note because Christianity will be the unifying force that connects Europe together. And we'll see this, and again, we'll talk about religion not in dogmatic ways, but rather as political arguments to show you its influence in this world in many different ways, even economically. So what do we learn? Number one, we see how Christianity by the 4th century becomes the major driving force for Europe, right? Like I said a minute ago, it connects people together. They might be from different regions, but the one thing they have in common is this faith. And understand too that the Middle Ages is a fusion of many beliefs. There's no such thing as pure Christianity. You have a fusion of Roman Greek ideas, right, with Neoplatonism. They implement pagan rituals such as Christmas and Easter and a few other things. And then you do have religious dogma, right, that becomes part of the Bible. So when we think of Christianity as a belief system, from a historical sense, we have to understand too that it's a fusion, right, of paganism, of Greek philosophy, and of Christian literature too. So it's the hodgepodge of many beliefs. And then the last point that we presented is this idea that ultimate authority, really by the 6th, 7th century, begins to fall on the Catholic Church, particularly in the western part of what was once the Roman Empire. Part of it has to do with just a power vacuum. The Roman emperor basically left it alone, even though they tried to reconquer it, such as Justinian. But it was just too difficult to maintain. So we see how the Catholic Church becomes a very important institution during the Middle Ages. So we'll stop it there.